Assalamu alaikum. Hope you're all doing fine. I'm Dr. Muhammad Ali Rahmani, Assistant Professor Anatomy. Inshallah, I will be your guide today for the lecture of the orbital cavity. Today, the contents of our lecture are going to be the orbital cavity itself, the bony socket. We will discuss the bones, the forming the margins of the orbital cavity in the front, making the walls of the orbital cavity, the openings that are present in them, and the overall relations of the orbital cavity to the nearby cavities. Then we'll discuss the muscles, what are its functions, how they are attached, what are their nerve supply, along which axis do they move, and how do we test them. Then we will move on to the structures, the vessels, and nerves of the orbit, majorly the branches of the ophthalmic artery, and the nerves will include the motor and the sensory nerves present there. In the eye, we will see its outer coverings, the fibrous coat. Then we will dive into the deeper structures that will include the other layers, the lens, the cornea, all the other things inside as we move along. And before ending, we will discuss the a little functional uh, pathways also. We will discuss the visual pathway, its abnormalities, and the pathway for reflex and accommodation and their abnormalities. And then we will close the lecture by discussing the eyelid anatomy and the anatomy of the lacrimal apparatus. Let's start with our topic for today. That is, let's start with the orbital margin. The orbital cavity, it opens to the front with the open to the front, and this margin of bone that demarcates the entry point of the orbital cavity, that is known as the orbital margin. We can see very easily from here which structures are making this socket. If we see from the superior wall, we will be discussing along four walls: the superior wall, the lateral wall, the medial wall, and the inferior wall. Supraorbital margin, infraorbital margin, and the lateral and medial margins. So if you can see from the supraorbital margin, it is simply made up of the frontal bone, shown in the green here, and that thing, the anatomically different thing that can be seen on its medial aspect is this. There may be a presence of a notch, or in case of some people, a foramen. Foramen will be the continuity of the bone will be intact, but there will be opening right here. So there will be a notch or a foramen that is known as supraorbital notch or foramen. So these are the features of the upper margin. When talking about the inferior margin is made up of two bones, as you can see from the color coding. Here, it is made up of the maxillary bone, shown by the purple here, and here it is made up of the zygomatic bone. It is made up of the zygomatic and maxillary bone. Zygomatic bone will be the strongest one in the whole of the orbit, and it usually survives when the other bones do not survive the fracture. Then there is the lateral wall and the medial wall. If we look at the lateral wall, it is made up of the frontal bone above and the zygomatic bone below, and in between them there is a suture, the fronto-zygomatical suture. In the medial wall, there are two bones, the frontal bone above and the maxillary bone below. There is a little addition to these words. This particular part of the frontal bone that is coming down to meet the maxilla, that will be the maxillary process of the frontal bone, this part. And this part that is going up to meet the frontal, that will be frontal process of the maxillary bone. If you don't remember it, just mention the frontal bone and the maxillary bone and you will be fine. These are the orbits. Let's look at the walls. It is easy to think of an orbit as a tipped over pyramid. Usually the pyramid is like this. There is a base there and there are walls that are going to the apex like this. So if we tip it over like this, it will be something like this. Okay. So this is how the orbit is. This is the opening of the orbit and we look inside to the base. So let's make it a pyramid. Then we will discuss it walls. So this is the base of the pyramid. This is the base of the tipped over pyramid. This is the apex. So these are forming the walls. So we will be discussing the medial wall, the superior wall or roof, the lateral wall, and the inferior wall or the floor. So these will be the structures that we will be discussing. So let's look at it in this very image. Which structures are making which structure? Which wall? The superior wall, it is made up of the orbital plate of the frontal bone. The frontal bone makes it, if you don't remember the orbital, that's fine too. It is made up of orbital plate of the frontal bone. Above it, there will be the middle cranial fossa. A part of the roof is made up of the lesser wing of sphenoid. You can see right here. This is the part of the roof. This structure, this supraorbital fissure, labeled right here, and it is shown in the picture in this slit. This is the demarcating boundary between the floor above, the roof above, and the lateral wall on the lateral aspect. So this is the roof of the orbit made up of the orbital process of the frontal bone and the lesser wing of sphenoid. Onto the floor. The floor is made up of two bones, rather three bones. On the medial aspect, there is the maxillary bone, as shown in the purple here. This whole area, it is made up of the maxillary bone. This is the floor. If you look inside like there, it is not very visible on this view, but if you look from above, you will be able to see the less part of the roof floor made up of the zygomatic bone. Then we are left with this small bone, not very visible in the first glance, this bone right here. It is a part of the palatine bone that is known as the orbital process as is coming to the orbital plate. And this is the bone that we did discuss when talking about the sphenopalatine foramen. So making the there are three bones making the floor of the orbit. The major component will be the maxillary bone. On the lateral aspect, the lesser will be the zygomatic bone, and on the back, there will be a very small process of the orbital plate of the palatine bone. Then there is the lateral wall. From front to back, it is consisting of the zygomatic bone, shown in the blue here, and then there is the greater wing of sphenoid. This lateral wall is separated from the roof by this fissure, that is supraorbital fissure, and this lateral wall is separated from the floor by this fissure known as the infraorbital fissure. So it is separated from the two by supraorbital and infraorbital fissures, and it is made up of two bones, front to back, zygomatic and greater wing of sphenoid. That leaves us with the medial wall. The medial wall contains a large number of bones. If we go from front to back, you can see this is the margin of the orbit. So from this margin to here, there will be the part of the maxilla. There will be maxillary bone, frontal process of maxilla. Then we will see the bone that is shown in the blue here. This is the lacrimal bone. If we go back, the third bone will be the ethmoid bone. And if you go further back, it will be this bone, that is the body of the sphenoid bone. So these are the bones that are making the medial wall of the orbit. Front to back, there will be maxilla, then lacrimal bone, then ethmoid bone, and then the then the body of the sphenoid bone. A few bony features that can be visible if you look very closely. Here, you can see a fossa. This fossa is housing the lacrimal sac, the part of the system that collects the tears and they send them to the nasal cavity. That is the lacrimal sac. It is placed right here in this groove, so this groove is known as lacrimal groove. Its anterior raised margin, anterior lacrimal crest is the part of maxilla, its posterior raised margin, the posterior lacrimal crest is the part of the lacrimal bone. And of course, we will see the suture between them. Going back to the ethmoid bone, here in the picture, in the bright yellow, you are seeing through the bone the ethmoid sinuses that are present beyond this bone between the orbital cavity and the nasal cavity. In actual skull, if you shine a bright light, you do see them, and these are due to the fact that this part of the ethmoid bone is very thin, it is paper thin, it is called lamina papyracea, paper thin bone. And on the back, the body of the sphenoid bone that is present here, it majorly consists of this opening that is known as optic canal. Optic canal. So, relations of the orbit. Overall, the orbit anteriorly, it is opening to the exterior through the orbital margin and it is only covered with eyelid. Posteriorly, there was the apex. Apex had the opening of the optic canal and apex had the opening of superior orbital fissures. And the inferior orbital fissure is the most medial part. So the optic canal is opening into the middle cranial fossa, superior orbital fissure is opening into the middle cranial fossa, and this medialmost part of the inferior orbital fissure is opening into the pterygopalatine fossa. And infratemporal fossa, we will discuss the lateral parts here. They are opening into the infratemporal fossa. We will go into that. Above, the roof of the orbit is making the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. So if anything that penetrates this roof, it goes through the bone, through the meninges to the frontal lobe that is present in the anterior cranial fossa. Medially, there was nasal cavity, and in between the nasal cavity and the orbital cavity, there is a presence of ethmoid air sinuses. Below, there was maxillary sinus. You see the bone, zygomatic bone right here, and medially there is a maxillary bone. The maxillary bone from the inside is hollow, and here a cavity is present that is present all the way right here. So that cavity is known as maxillary sinus. It can be accessed from the lateral wall of the nose. It is related to the inferior wall of the orbit and it is related to the superior aspect of the upper jaw teeth. So this is the maxillary sinus. We will be discussing it in more detail when we talked about the respiratory system. Orbital openings. The one some of them we have seen, some we did not. Let's discuss them one by one. The orbital opening. The biggest of the opening is the obvious one, the orbital margin. This whole one, this is the orbital opening, main orbital opening. There are some structures, there are many structures that are exiting through this opening. For example, there is supraorbital artery with supraorbital vein. There is supratrochlear artery with supratrochlear vein and supratrochlear nerve. So there will be supraorbital and supratrochlear structures, artery, vein, and nerve. There will be structure exiting, artery exiting right here to the external of the nose. That will be known as dorsal nasal artery. It will be accompanied by a nerve that will exit along with it. That will be known as infratrochlear nerve. We will see them shortly, inshallah. And then there will be branches from the lacrimal nerve. So after supplying the lacrimal gland, it may come out and supply the lids outside. So these are the structures that are coming out from the orbital opening. Then there is supraorbital groove shown right here, supraorbital notch, supraorbital foramen, supraorbital groove. Depending upon the exact bony shape, it has a different names. This notch contains the artery, vein, and nerves of the same name. It will contain supraorbital artery, it will contain supraorbital vein, and it will contain supraorbital nerve. Then there is this opening, the nasolacrimal duct, nasolacrimal canal. It will house the nasolacrimal duct, and as the name indicates, the duct connects the lacrimal part with nasal part. It connects the lacrimal sac present in the fossa here with the nasal cavity. As we will discuss, it will open into the inferior nasal meatus. If we look at the back, there is presence of two fissures, this one and this one. The one that the slit that is going upwards and laterally, that is known as superior orbital fissure. It is present between the body and lesser wing of sphenoid and the greater wing of sphenoid, and it is opening back into the middle cranial fossa. A number of things enter from here, and most of them are nerves. That includes the nerves in a single line, in a single arrangement. Number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6. It consists of the oculomotor nerve. It does not enter independently or singly. The two divisions enter. The superior division of the oculomotor, the inferior division of oculomotor. Then there is the trochlear nerve. Then the two of the three parts of the trigeminal nerve enter here. The ophthalmic division, it's the one that actually does supply all of the structures in the sensory component of the orbit. And then there is a maxillary nerve that has entered the orbit after giving branches to the pterygopalatine fossa, and it then gives rise to two branches, that is zygomatical branch and then orbital nerve as a terminal branch. Talking about the first division of the trigeminal nerve, that is the ophthalmic division, it does not enter as itself. It breaks into three branches, the frontal, lacrimal, and nasociliary, and they enter independently into the orbit. So these branches are entering independently. Then we are left with veins. The veins that are present here are in the orbit. There is superior ophthalmic vein here, inferior ophthalmic vein here. The superior one will exit through the superior fissure and inferior one will exit through the inferior fissure. So in addition to the nerves we just discussed, the vein, the superior ophthalmic vein will exit the superior orbital fissure to go to the cavernous sinus on the back. Then there is inferior orbital fissure. Inferior orbital fissure, it is present between the greater wing of sphenoid and the zygomatic and maxillary bone. It enters into two places. If we look at medial aspect, it is going into the pterygopalatine fossa. And if we look at the lateral aspect, it is going to be opening into infratemporal fossa. So it is opening on two different areas depending upon its location, medially pterygopalatine fossa and laterally infratemporal fossa. Overall, which structures are passing through it? Basically, the maxillary nerve on its way from the pterygopalatine fossa, it enters into the orbit through this fissure. The maxillary nerve itself and its zygomatic branch, they enter independently to the orbit here. The zygomatic branch has already separated from the main maxillary nerve in the pterygopalatine fossa. As it come maxillary nerve come forward, it changes its name to the infraorbital nerve and it enters the infraorbital canal and exits from in the front of the cheek. That brings us to this foramen, the infraorbital canal. The infraorbital canal houses the artery, vein, and nerves of the same name. It houses the infraorbital nerve, infraorbital artery, and infraorbital vein. Then there are 3 or 4 more foramina that can be seen here. The foramina that are present at the junction of the medial wall and the roof. These are the anterior ethmoidal foramina and posterior ethmoidal foramina. They are usually present at the junction of the ethmoid bone and the frontal bone, and they contains the structure by the same name. Anterior ethmoidal foramen will contain the artery, vein, and nerve, the anterior ethmoidal artery, the anterior ethmoidal vein, and anterior ethmoidal vein nerve. And the same will be true for the posterior ethmoidal artery, vein, and nerve. On the lateral aspect, in the zygomatic bone, there are 2 openings. The one opening in the zygomatic bone, it will come and exits on the front of the cheek. That will be zygomatico-facial canal opening onto the zygomatico-facial foramen. And it will contain the structures of the same name, zygomatico-facial, artery, vein, and nerve. And then there will be a foramen, that the canal that will run to the back of and open into the temporal fossa. That will be known as zygomatico-temporal canal, and the structures that are exiting through it, the artery, vein, and nerve, they will come to the temporal fossa. Some of them will go to the surface of the temple and go and supply the scalp, especially the nerve, and they may come and wind around the zygomatic bone to come to the anterior aspect also. So these are all the foramina and the structures that are covered by them. Let's talk about the orbital fascia. The orbital canal itself, in addition to the vessels and nerves that are making it, it is filled with fat. But here in the white, this is a picture from Natus Atlas. You can see that the walls are covered with periosteum on either side, and this periosteum, it's continuous around the muscles, and this fascia, this is continuous around the eyeball also. So this facial layer that is outside the eye, that is outside the sclera, keep it separate from the sclera, because sclera is also known as the fibrous coat of the eyeball. This facial layer that is extending back to the dura mater around the eye, around the optic nerve, this fascia is known as facial sheath of the eyeball, or the other name is Tenon's capsule. This is known as Tenon's capsule. This becomes very important when you are talking to the ophthalmologist, because between the Tenon's capsule and the sclera, there is a presence of this space, the episcleral space. And in this space, there is a very loose connective tissue and some blood vessels running inside. Sometimes the some drugs are administered in this space also as a treatment purpose. So this is the space, the epicleral space between the tenous capsule outside and the sclera inside. This space, it's continued with the fascia around them, the muscles around them, the fascia of the muscles around them continued back with the sheaths covering the optic nerve, and on the side it becomes continuous with the periosteum. As we can see from here, this point and this point, the facial sheaths, they become thick and triangular as they get attached from the muscles to the wall of the orbit. These are known as check ligaments. These are known as check ligaments. Why they are called check ligaments? Because you can see, if this person, this is the right eye, if this person tries to look left, the eye will move and this muscle, this lateral rectus muscle, will stretch. This point will come here and this ligament will get taut. It will prevent the eye from going too far medially, too far to the left side. So it has checked its movements. And same will be true for the check ligament on the opposite side. This fascia, this tenon's capsule or orbital fascia, it is especially thick on the undersurface. It is shown in this picture of the Snell. Because it is very thick on the undersurface, it is actually hanging the eye, it is actually holding the eye as hammock. Hammock is the bed made up of fiber, made up of a piece of cloth hanging between the two trees. This is the hammock. In Urdu, in our culture, we have a bed hanging of the child hanging under our beds with a cloth that is known as pangoda in our language. So it's like that. It is the pangoda. It is the hammock that suspends the eye. And it is so important in sustaining the weight of the eye. It is the one that keeps the eyeball in its normal place. The eyeball, it's not here due to the inferior wall of the orbit. It is there due to the suspensory ligament of Lockwood. And this is made more prominent by the fact that if due to some chronic infection or due to some pathology or due to some tumors, a delicate surgery is done sometimes to remove the walls of the maxilla. If we surgically remove the infraorbital wall or the roof of the maxilla and we don't touch anything else, then the eyeball does not fall. The eyeball remain in its normal position even with the inferior wall of the orbit removed. So this emphasizes the role of the suspensory ligament of Lockwood. Let's talk about the muscles of the orbit. Muscles of the orbit can be divided into two parts: the extraocular and intraocular. It is so simple by the name that all of the muscles that are attached to the outside will be known as the extraocular muscles, as opposed to the muscles that are present within the eyeball itself. So immediately now, I will be talking about the muscles of the orbit that are present outside, in other words known as extraocular muscles. I know this is a little heavy slide, but I will go through it bit by bit, step by step, and inshallah we will go through all of these things. Keep in mind our targets for reading these things are: where does the muscle originate and insert, what is its function, and how does it affect the movement of eye across three axes. We will be discussing the movement of eyeball in the transverse, vertical, and anteroposterior axis. I will explain to them shortly, but first I would like to discuss the origin and insertion of the muscles. You can see from the orbit, this is the medial wall of the orbit. and these are the lateral wall of the orbit. So orbital cavity, it's like a cone that is diverging a little. The base of the cone is going front and laterally. You can see if there is a middle axis, it will be going like this. So the cone is going front and lateral. So that will be the direction of the whole of the muscles. It will not be the front exactly, it will be going front and lateral. If we look to the back, if we look to the apex of this pyramid, first roll me back a little. There are 6 muscles that are going to be attached to the eyeball. 4 muscles on 4 aspects: the superior, the inferior, the medial, the lateral. These muscles will be known as recti: superior rectus, inferior rectus, medial rectus, lateral rectus. 2 muscles are attached to the superior and inferior surface, but they are approaching it from a different angle than the rest of the muscle, an oblique angle. So they will be known as superior oblique and inferior oblique. Let's look at the recti first. All of the recti muscles, the superior, middle, and inferior recti muscle, they are originating from the apex of our pyramid in a ring. Here is the superior rectus, inferior rectus, lateral rectus, and medial rectus. This whole ring, it's called the tendinous ring of Zen. This is the tendinous ring of Zen. Let's look at the attachment of these muscles. The superior rectus muscle, it originates from the superior aspect of the tendinous ring, and it goes anterolaterally and it gets attached to the anterior half of the eyeball. It gets attached to the anterior half of the eyeball, anterior to the equator. All of these 4 recti are going to be inserted to the anterior part of the eyeball, anterior to the mid of the eyeball. So this is superior rectus attached to the superior surface. This is the lateral rectus going laterally attached to the lateral surface, anterior to the half. Here the this muscle, the 2 muscles are seen here. The superior muscles is levator palpebrae superioris. I will get to it shortly. Just beneath it, this muscle going, it's attached to the superior surface in the anterior half. That will be superior rectus. And then we are left with inferior rectus that has a similar attachment. Please note that these muscles are approaching eyeball from medial aspect. They are not approaching eyeball from just back. They are coming from the posteromedial aspect and attaching them. That thing will be important when we talk about the movements. Then there are 2 oblique muscles. Both of the oblique muscles have origin outside the tendinous ring of Zen. The superior oblique has an origin just supramedial to this tendinous ring. It goes along the roof, along the junction of the roof and the medial wall. It goes all the way there, and on the medial most aspect of the roof, on the anterior margin, there is a pulley known as trochlea. From the trochlea, it comes back and attached to the superior surface on the back aspect of the eyeball. This is known as superior oblique muscle. As you can see, as opposed to all rest of the muscles, it is coming from the anteromedial aspect. All of the other muscles were coming from posteromedial aspect. So it has a different approach. The inferior oblique muscle will be parallel to the superior oblique muscle. It is more better seen here. The superior oblique is shown from the lateral aspect coming here. The inferior oblique, it is originating from the floor of the orbit and is going to be inserted on the back of the eyeball. These 2 muscles are parallel to one another and both are approaching the eyeball from anteromedial aspect. Then we are left with levator palpebrae superioris. It has origin just above the tendinous ring of Zen and it gets inserted on the upper eyelid. Okay, let's talk about the axis of movements. The eyeball Let me make a few adjustments here. The eyeball, it is capable of moving in three axes. I have a globe here taken from my sun's table. The eyeball can be moved across the vertical axis, the vertical axis will move from the top to bottom. If here is the pupil, the eyeball can move laterally, it can move medially. So I will be talking about right eye as a reference. So when we are talking about this along the vertical axis, the eye can look laterally, that is known as abduction, and the eye can look medially, that is known as adduction. The second axis will be the transverse axis. This is the transverse axis going from side to side, going from side to side, and along this axis the eye can look up, elevation, or the eye can look down, depression. And then we are left with anteroposterior axis. It is not very nicely visible in our eyes because our pupils and iris are uniform and they do not have any tattoos on them. So this is the axis that move from anteroposterior direction, that is the anteroposterior axis, and the eyeball move along it in this direction, that is known as intorsion, and it can move in this direction. I'm talking about the right eye, that will be known as extorsion. So these are the three sets of movements that can be present here. In the vertical axis there can be adduction and abduction. In the horizontal axis there can be elevation and depression, and along the anteroposterior axis there can be intorsion and extorsion. Let's talk about the functions of the muscles along the three axes, all of them. Let's talk about superior oblique. Let's talk about superior rectus first. Superior rectus is attached to the and I'm talking again, talking about the superior surface. The superior rectus, it's attaching the superior surface. This is the right eye, and it is approaching from the medial aspect. When it is contract, it will move the eyeball up. It will help in elevation. It will help you to look up. Now, the thing about the medial uh, approach becomes important. When you look at the vertical axis, superior rectus is attached to the superior surface and it is coming from the medial aspect. We're talking about the right eye. When it contracts, it moves the eyeball medially. It is helping you to look medially. It is helping you with adduction. The third one, we are left with intorsion or extorsion along vertical anteroposterior axis. So it was attached to the superior surface. It was approaching from the medial aspect. When it contracts, it will help in intorsion. So these are the movements by the superior rectus. It is helping, superior rectus is helping in elevation. Superior rectus in helping in medial rotation, or it is helping in adduction, and anteroposteriorly it is helping in intorsion. Talking about the right eye, of course it will be same with the left eye, but visually I am talking about the right eye. All of the things opposites will be true for the inferior rectus. Inferior rectus is attached to the anterior half of the lower surface, approaching from the medial aspect. When it contract the right eye, talking about right eye, it will lead to downward looking of the eye. This is depression. When talking about the vertical axis, the inferior rectus will help you look. Can you guess it before I do it? Medially. It helps you look towards the medial aspect. It helps you look to do adduction. And we are left with the anteroposterior axis. Let me get my muscle insertion. fresh hair, and we are left with the anteroposterior axis. Okay, here. The anteroposterior axis, the inferior rectus is attached. If we do like this, okay, this is the anteroposterior axis. This is the inferior rectus attached right here, and this is its medial approach. We're talking about the right eye. So when it contracts, it will move the upper surface of the eyeball laterally and and lower surface of the eyeball medially. That is known as extorsion. So you can see it right here. So these are the functions of the inferior rectus. Along transverse axis, it was doing depression. Along vertical axis, it was helping in medial rotation or adduction. Along anteroposterior axis, it was helping to move the eyeball extorsion, the upper surface laterally, the lower surface medially. We have done superior rectus, inferior rectus. Let's talk about the medial and lateral rectus. They are very simple. The medial rectus is attached here on the midline. It is just going backwards. It is only working to do medial movement of the eyeball, that is adduction. There will be no component for the superior and inferior, and there will be no component for the intorsion extorsion. And the same will be true for the lateral rectus. This globe is representing the right eye. The lateral rectus coming from here, it will move the eyeball laterally. It will help in abduction. Okay, now there is superior oblique and inferior oblique. Before showing them here, let me talk about the muscle. The superior oblique, it is, if we talk about the right eye, the superior oblique, it's coming from the apex of the pyramid, but before it inserts, it turns around the pulley, and come back to the orbit right here. So this will be the direction of pull of muscle in front of it. This will be the direction of pull of muscle. It will be different. So let us look along the transverse axis. I'm not talking about whole of the muscle. I will be talking about this pull of muscle. My hand is anterior to the globe now. My hand is medial to the globe now. This is the right eye. Superior oblique, when it contracts, it will pull the continent of Australia inferiorly. So it is doing depression of the eye. When talking about the vertical axis, let's get Africa in front of you. The muscle direction is like this, coming from anteromedial aspect. When it contracts, it moves the front of the eyeball laterally. So it is abducting the eyeball. And what we are left with? We are left with anteroposterior axis about the intorsion and extorsion. And this is the approach of the superior oblique from the anteromedial aspect. When it pulls like this, the upper surface of the eyeball moves medially. That is the intorsion. And in the end, we are left with inferior oblique. You may have guessed most of this by now. The inferior oblique will have all of the opposite effects. Again, it is approaching from the anteromedial aspect, from the inferior surface like this. This is anterior to the globe, my hand, the direction of pull. When it contracts, it will move the eye pupils, move the eye superiorly. It helps in elevation along the vertical axis here. If you see like this, it will move the eye laterally, and then we are left with anteroposterior axis. I will have to do it like this. It is attached to the back, pulling from the anteromedial aspect. When it pulls, it does extorsion. The upper surface is going laterally and the lower surface is going medially. So this is all about the movements of the muscles producing the movements of the eyeball. I will go to the clinical testing just in a while. So to summarize, these are the tables that you can see. These are present in your book. This is from the Snell's anatomy. Let me remove myself. This is the picture from the Snell's anatomy, and this is the picture from Gray's Atlas, Gray's anatomy, and this the Gray's it is very practical in the sense of talking in the axes. So you don't have to remember exactly the origin and insertions. About the origin and insertion, the point you have to remember is that four recti are coming from the ring. Superior oblique is coming above the ring, but it turns around the pulley. And the inferior rectus, inferior oblique is coming from the floor of the orbit on the medial aspect, anteromedial aspect. About the insertion, all four recti are inserted anterior to the mid-half, anterior to the equator, on the surface as demarcated by their name. Superior rectus will attach to the upper surface anterior to the equator, and so on and so forth for the medial, for the lateral, so the inferior. And both of the obliques are attached on the posterior half of the eyeball, posterior to the equator, on the surfaces indicated by their name. Superior oblique will be attached on the back of the equator, on the upper surface, on the superior surface of the eyeball. The movements we have discussed along the axis, I will not be dragging this much longer. You can pause the video here, you can go back and try out for yourself, work it out how these muscles work. But to summarize, I want to summarize from this slide again. I would like to summarize by the movements now. The superior movement, the elevation of the eyeball. The elevation of the eyeball was done both by the superior rectus and the inferior oblique. And the depression similarly was done both by the inferior rectus and superior oblique. But you can see that this was the elevation and depression. Let's talk about adduction and abduction. It is very simple. The medial rectus does the adduction, the lateral rectus does the abduction. However, both of the recti, superior rectus and inferior rectus, were approaching from the posterior medial aspect. They were both responsible for moving the anterior surface medially, that was adduction. Superior rectus and inferior rectus were both involved with adduction. However, both the obliques, the superior and inferior, were approaching from the anteromedial aspect, attaching to the posterior surface, and they were responsible for abduction. When talking about the elevation and depression, the elevation was done by superior rectus and inferior oblique. One of them, the rectus, was responsible for adduction, and the oblique was responsible for abduction. So they cancel the lateral and medial movements, and when working together, they help the eye to remain in the midline and look up without deviating for the abduction and the adduction. So this is about the elevation depression, and then we are left with the intorsion and extorsion, both of the muscles that are attached to the superior surface, superior oblique and superior rectus, they are doing the intorsion, and both of the muscle attached to the inferior surface, inferior rectus and inferior oblique are doing the extorsion. So this is an interesting thing to remember, interesting way to remember it. When talking about adduction and abduction, both we will discuss the recti. Both the recti will adduct, both the obliques will abduct. And when talking about intorsion and extorsion, both the superiors will intort and both the inferiors will extort. So this is all about the eye. This is all about the muscles and the axis and the movements, and we are left with the nerve supply. And there is a very interesting mnemonic. You may have all know it by now. Before I tell you, LR6SO4. LR6SO4. So lateral rectus is supplied by cranial nerve number 6, and superior oblique is applied by the cranial nerve number 4. And both of these nerves are named for these muscles. Lateral rectus abduct the eye, and cranial nerve number 6 is named as abduction. And superior oblique passes through the trochlea before changes in direction, and on that honor the name of this muscle is nerve is named as trochlear nerve. And we are left with all the rest of the muscles. Those are supplied by cranial nerve number 3. Rest are supplied by oculomotor nerve. It has superior division and inferior division. We will look at it shortly. So all of the rest are supplied by this. And then, last but not the least, we come to the clinical testing. Here, one thing we want to discuss. Again, I'm going back to the globe. I hope so. It is not too much distracting for you. Let me get my background back. Okay. The superior oblique and inferior rectus were both responsible for depression, and superior rectus and inferior rectus were both responsible for elevation. Let's talk about both of them separately. Again, this is the right eye. We will only be talking about horizontal axis. You see this superior rectus was elevating the eyeball. However, this oblique nature, this line shown anteroposteriorly, this is the anteroposterior axis, and this line is the axis of the eyeball. If we are looking like this front, we will see the superior oblique approaching with an angle to the anteroposterior axis of the eyeball. However, if the person was looking towards the right, if the person was looking laterally, like this, now you may able to see that superior rectus is perfectly aligned and perfectly in line to mm, parallel to the long axis of the eye, and it is in perfect position to elevate the eye. So when looking laterally, the chief elevator will be superior rectus. When looking laterally, chief elevator will be superior rectus, because now the anteroposterior axis of the eye, it's parallel to the length of the muscle. It is shown with the first picture, picture number A, the one in the orange, the one where my pointer is. So although looking laterally, abduction is not a function of the superior rectus, but when with the when we are looking laterally, the superior rectus is parallel to the long axis of the eye, and it will be the chief elevator. So when we have to check the function of the superior rectus, when we are talking about the right eye, we ask the person to look right and then look up. Look laterally and then look up, and that is how we check the superior rectus. Now get my point a little more on that point. Superior rectus was doing, this is the eye looking forward now. Superior rectus was responsible for looking upwards. What if that person was looking medially? You see, this is the long axis of the eye now. This is the long axis of the muscle now. Long axis of the eye, long axis of the muscle. Those are 90 degrees to one another now. And they have almost, I'm pulling on this, and you can see there is minimum movement. I'm pulling on it, and there is a minimum movement because I am just parallel to the axis. There is no leverage. So when we are looking medially and upward, superior rectus, it's almost not playing any role. Which muscle is playing the role here now? Then the muscle that plays the role here is the superior oblique. Now it is was coming from anteromedial aspect, so it will be the inferior oblique. Sorry, it was coming from the anteromedial aspect, and it will be responsible for moving the eyeball upward in the medially. So when we are going to check the inferior oblique mentioned here, we will ask the person to look medially and look up. And similarly, we can check it for this is the origin point that will remain the same. And if the eye is looking all the way laterally, the axis became parallel to the pull of the muscle and it will have almost no effect on elevating and depressing the eye. So that is why the clinical testing it is different from functions. And in a 5 to 6 years of my teaching anatomy, I have seen a lot of students getting confused at this point. So keep the functions separate from the clinical testing. When talking about the function, when talking about the function of the superior rectus, we mentioned that it was moving the eye medially and upwards. But when talking about the clinically testing, we talk about the superior rectus, we said that we ask the person to look laterally and upward. And it is not due to the fact that we want to see the lateral moving function. It is due to the fact that when we ask the person to look laterally, the long axis of the eye becomes parallel to the long axis of the muscle. So that is why when checking oblique, we ask the person to look laterally and then look up and look down for the superior rectus and inferior rectus respectively. And as you can see, the long axis of the eye, it's parallel to the long axis of the muscles. And when we have to check the obliques, we ask the person to look medially and look up and look down to check the inferior oblique and superior oblique respectively, because this is the case when the long axis of the eye it's parallel to the pull of the muscles. Next, we will start the nerves of the orbit. I will take a little breather here, and with me the time is 1:13. I will continue at 5 minutes 1:18. Inshallah. If you have any questions meanwhile, you can post it in the comments. I will continue from here in 5 minutes. Welcome back. Mhm. Okay, let me get a few things straightened out. Then we'll start. Okay, let's talk about the nerves of the orbit. Okay, first talk about the sensory nerves. The two main sensory nerves that enter the orbit is the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve and almost completely distributed within the orbital cavity and its structures. Then we will talk about the part of the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve that enters the orbit. And in the last, we will talk about the motor nerves, that is the oculomotor nerve, its branches that are supplying different muscles. So this is the trigeminal nerve exiting from the front of the pons. It has a big ganglia, the trigeminal ganglion, in the top of the petrous bone in the middle cranial fossa. From here, you can see the mandibular, maxillary, and ophthalmic divisions exiting. The ophthalmic division, before entering the orbit, it gives rise to this meningeal branch that gets separated and it goes back to the tentorium cerebelli. We'll talk about the ones that are going to the orbit. You can see from this picture, they divide into the three branches before it actually enters the orbit. The one going laterally is the lacrimal branch, this one. The one going superiorly is the frontal branch, and the one going deep right here, this will be the nasociliary. Let's follow the first two here. The lacrimal nerve, it moves laterally. It moves on the upper aspect superior relation to the lateral rectus muscle, and it runs parallel along with the muscle to go to supply the lacrimal gland as shown by the name. It's so simple. It gives the sensory supply to the lacrimal gland. And if you can see from here, if you can see right here, you will see there are fibers that go beyond the lacrimal gland and they go to supply to the skin on the top of it. So they will give the cutaneous supply of the lacrimal nerve. Lacrimal gland is, after all, a gland. In addition to the sensory supply, it will need a parasympathetic and sympathetic pathway nerve also. So these, especially parasympathetic for secretion. This parasympathetic, they come from this communicating branch. They are actually coming from this ganglion, pterygopalatine ganglion. We will discuss how the presynaptic reach it. Presynaptic reach it from the nerve of pterygopalatine ganglion and synapse here. This postsynaptic fiber, this pathway will be asked again and again in the orbit, in the nerves of the orbit, and in the supply of the lacrimal gland and in the cranial nerves pathways also. The postsynaptic neuron, it will go through the connection to the maxillary nerve. In the maxillary nerve, it will go into the zygomatic branch. From the zygomatic branch, it will go into the temporal branch, zygomatico-temporal branch. Then rather than going outside to the temporal fossa, it moves, the parasympathetic fiber moves through the communicating branch and they jump onto the lacrimal nerve. And from the lacrimal nerve, they go and supply the lacrimal gland to produce the tears. So this pathway becomes important because any injury to the lacrimal nerve may lead to absence of the eye, tears in the eye that leads to drying of the ear. Similarly, any injury here, pterygopalatine fossa, this will lead to the absence of tears in the eye even when the lacrimal nerve was totally intact. Lacrimal gland will not be able to produce the tears because it was not being supplied by this parasympathetic supply. So this is the supply of the lacrimal gland. This is all about the lacrimal nerve. Let's talk about the frontal nerve. It is very simple. The frontal nerve runs on the top, on the roof of the orbit, just below the roof, just above the highest most muscle. It runs between the levator palpebrae superioris and the roof of the orbit. And before exiting, it breaks into two branches, the medial one known as supratrochlear nerve and the lateral one in the supraorbital nerve. We have discussed supraorbital and supratrochlear names many times by now, and the supraorbital orbital one goes all the way. It runs above the trochlea. Here is the trochlea, this one where my mouse cursor is, the white one. And it runs over it. It exits from the medial aspect of the superior margin, and it runs and supply the medial aspect of the forehead all the way up to the hairline. Then there is this frontal nerve. It divides into, the rest is the supraorbital nerve. It is the larger one, you can see by the diameter. It will break into the medial and lateral branches, and they will, especially the later branches, they will exit through the supraorbital notch, and they will go onto the supply on the forehead just lateral to the supply of the supratrochlear, and they will go all the way back onto the scalp to the vertex. This was about the suprafrontal nerve. And then we are left with nasociliary nerve. Nasociliary nerve, it's a little tricky. It's not a little tricky, but little extensive. It's a better word to use. Nasociliary nerve is the third branch. It is a little deeper. It is not visible when the superior rectus and levator palpebrae superioris are on the surface. To look at it in the picture below, the muscles levator palpebrae superioris, the rectus superior, and the belly of the superior oblique have been removed, and then you can see this nerve, that is nasociliary nerve. This is the nasociliary nerve. This has separated from the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve before entering into the orbit. It enters separately. It crosses medial to lateral above the optic nerve. That is a very interesting question that is usually asked in the examination. That nasociliary nerve crosses on the top of the optic nerve when moving medial to lateral, and it comes here. It comes to lie on the top of the medial rectus. It runs all the way to the front, and it exits as infratrochlear nerve. Let's talk about its branches. Nasociliary nerve, when it enters the orbit, it comes to lie on the top of the optic nerve. If you can see, just supralateral to the optic nerve, here there is a presence of ciliary ganglion. This is the point where the parasympathetic fibers will relay before going to the orbit, before going to the eye. So there are branches that go from nasociliary nerve to the ciliary ganglion. So these branches that are going from the nasociliary nerve to the ciliary ganglion, these will be short ciliary branches. They will be short ciliary branches. Then if you move forward, they will be not short ciliary branches. They will be technically, sorry, I'm sorry for the confusion I have created. They will be known as sensory root of ciliary ganglion, or simply you can say the branches to the ciliary ganglion. The branches from the ciliary ganglion to the eyeball, these will be the short ciliary branches. Then there will be branches from the nasociliary nerve going from the nerve directly to the eye. These will be known as long ciliary nerve. The branches from the ciliary ganglion to the eye are short ciliary. The branches from nasociliary to eyeball are long ciliary. The sensory fibers are going from both of these passageways to the eyeball. They will go through the sensory root of the ciliary ganglion, through the ciliary ganglion, through the short ciliary to the eyeball, and they will go directly through long ciliary to the eyeball. And they will go on, and they will go on to supply the eyeball, especially the interior surface, especially the cornea. When you get dust in the eye, when you get a puff of wind in your eye, and when you get a cotton swab touched to the top of your cornea, you blink. The sensory supply for all of these cases was from the nasociliary nerve. It was coming to the nasociliary nerve either through long or short ciliary nerve, ultimately to the nasociliary nerve, then ophthalmic division, then trigeminal nerve, and so on. As we move forward, we have two more branches going to the two ethmoid foramina. One is this posterior ethmoidal artery nerve, and the one is the anterior ethmoidal nerve. The posterior ethmoidal nerve is not usually traced beyond this point because it goes on to the supply of the posterior ethmoidal sinuses and the neighboring bone. Some part of the sphenoid sinus may be supplied due to it. The anterior ethmoid sinus, it exits in the slit between the ethmoid bone below and the frontal bone above. and moving through this slit, it does supply during the movement, it does supply the anterior ethmoidal foramen sinuses, but it exits beyond the slit and it appears on the surface of the cribriform plate in the anterior cranial fossa. We will go into the further detail in the nasal cavity and in the lectures of cranial nerves, but from the anterior cranial fossa you can see it is dipping inside the nose between the cribriform plate and the crista galli and the crest. There's not this crest. So it is moving, dipping into the nose, and in the nose it will supply the anterior one third of the nose on the medial aspect, on the lateral aspect, and it will exit as the external nasal branch. It will then exit as an external nasal branch. So anterior ethmoidal nerve, this is the nerve that has gone up to the anterior cranial fossa and moved down to the nose, and from the nose it has come as an external nasal branch. So it has a very tricky pathway, and ultimately it leads to the tip of the nose being supplied by the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, because if you trace it back, external nasal branch will be traced back to the anterior ethmoidal nerve in the nose, it will trace back to the anterior ethmoidal nerve in the anterior cranial fossa, and it will be traced back to this nerve, nasociliary nerve in the orbit, all the way back to the ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve. And then we are left with the terminal branch of the nasociliary nerve. As we follow the nasociliary nerve, we have done the ciliary branches, we have done the long ciliary branches, and if we follow or look at the lateral aspect, we have done the posterior and ethmoidal nerve. And if we go forward, whatever remains of the nasociliary nerve beyond this point after anterior ethmoidal nerve, this is known as infratrochlear nerve. So these two are basically the terminal divisions of the nasociliary nerve, the anterior ethmoidal and the infratrochlear nerve. This infratrochlear nerve will continue the same pathway on the top of the middle rectus, and it will go all the way to the medial margin of the orbit, and it will exit below the trochlea to the dorsum of the nose. So you see, through the infratrochlear and the dorsal external nasal branch of anterior ethmoidal nerve, the dorsal aspect of the nose is completely being supplied by the nasociliary branch of the ophthalmic division of trigeminal nerve. Then there is the first, let's discuss this. Then there is oculomotor nerve. This is a picture from Gray's Anatomy. Oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3, it enters the orbit and it supplies the muscles. Which muscle did it have to supply? You remember LR6, SR4. So it has to supply the muscles other than levator, lateral rectus and superior oblique. So it divides into two divisions, the superior and inferior. The superior one goes and supply the muscles that are on the upper aspect of the eyeball, that are superior rectus. Superior will supply the superior rectus, and the muscle on top of that, that is the levator palpebrae superioris. And the inferior branch will supply all the rest of the muscle, that will now include the inferior rectus, inferior oblique, and middle rectus. This part of the oculomotor nerve contains both fibers. It contains both the sympathetic fibers and the parasympathetic fibers. It is very easy to remember with the help of mnemonic that sympathetic is S for sympathetic, S for superior. S for sympathetic, S for superior. So the sympathetic fibers are going through the superior division and they are going to supply the levator palpebrae superioris. Levator palpebrae superioris, the one that is elevating the eyelid, now has both the somatic supply and the sympathetic supply. The somatic supply helps you open the eyelid at your will. You want to open your eyelid as far as you can. So that is due to the somatic supply. But even if you are not doing anything, you are just sitting idly, there is some tone in the levator palpebrae superioris that maintains your muscle in a constant state of contraction and keep the eye open. So that is the sympathetic supply. And that is why when there is a Horner syndrome, when there is a loss of the sympathetic supply, the levator palpebrae superioris fails to function and it leads to ptosis. The ptosis means the drooping of the eyelid. Drooping of eyelid. So this is about the superior division. I'm not going into the detail of the muscle movements because I have dived into that quite extensively in the part behind. Then we are left with inferior, and this contains the parasympathetic fibers coming from Edinger-Westphal nucleus. We will discuss that nucleus in the cranial nerve section, and it does go on to supply the ciliary ganglion. Ciliary ganglion is the relay center where the pre-ganglionic fiber relay and supply the give rise to the post-ganglionic fibers. Let's trace these nerves in this picture. So here you can see this picture right here. The picture, the nerve that is cut here, that is the superior branch that will be going into the superior rectus and levator palpebrae superioris, and that will be the inferior branch that will supply the middle rectus, medial rectus, inferior rectus. It will supply the ciliary ganglion for the parasympathetic fibers, and it will continue to go to the inferior oblique. Two motor nerves still remaining, that is the nerve to the lateral rectus. This is the nerve, the abductor nerve. It runs on the medial aspect of the lateral rectus. It runs inside the cone and it terminates by fusing by ending inside this nerve, that is abductor nerve. The last nerve that is remaining is the supraorbital nerve, the trochlear nerve, not supraorbital nerve, trochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 4. It is independent. It enters the orbit independently and it runs to the superior surface of the superior oblique muscle and supplies that. So we are done with all of the nerves that are present in the orbit, the sensory and the motor one. And the last sensory structure that I would like to discuss is the ciliary ganglion. Ciliary ganglion, like all of the other ganglion, has three roots: sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the sensory ones. The sympathetic are coming directly from the internal carotid plexus and they will move without relaying shown by the blue line and will they go and supply the constrict dilator muscles of the pupils. The parasympathetic fibers are running with oculomotor nerve through the inferior division. They relay here. They synapse with the postsynaptic ganglion cells here, and from there the orange fiber shows the postsynaptic fibers. They go into the eye and they will supply the ciliary muscles and the constrictor pupillary muscles. And the sensory fibers are coming from the connection or the nasociliary nerve that go through them without synapsing, go through the short ciliary nerve and supply the sensory structures of the eye along with the long ciliary nerves. And then we are left with the last topic around the nerve that is sometimes asked in the MCQs and in the questions. It's something to be memorized, actually not very well understood, that which structures are entering the orbit inside the tendinous ring of Zen and which structures are entering the orbit outside the tendinous ring of Zen. Let's be done with the nerves, be done with the veins. The superior ophthalmic vein and the inferior ophthalmic vein, they go through the superior and inferior fissures respectively outside the ring. Simple. Optic canal is inside this tendinous ring. So all of the contents of this, that includes the optic nerve itself, accompanied by the ophthalmic artery, they comes within the ring. And then there are three branches of the ophthalmic division. Two of them are from the outside, lacrimal and frontal. If you remember, they were running on the outside aspect of the triangles. One was running with the lateral rectus muscle and one was running on the top of the orbit. So these were outside, the outsiders are outside, and the nasociliary nerve will be the inside. And we are left with the motor nerves there is trochlear, abducen, and oculomotor. The trochlear one will be coming from the outside, and the you see trochlear nerve is running on the upper aspect of the superior oblique. In the rest, the two divisions of the oculomotor and the nasociliary branch and the abducen nerve, they are running inside the abducen nerve between the two divisions of the oculomotor nerve. So that is about it. That is about the nerves of the orbit. Let us do the vessels of the orbit, then we will take a little breather. The vessels of the orbit are very simple. If you have done the nerves section behind, almost all the named branches of the nerves will be seen here in the as the named branches of the arteries. I will go through this picture first. There is only one big artery that is coming here, that is the ophthalmic artery. It runs to the lateral aspect of the optic nerve and then crosses it superiorly while moving from the lateral to medial aspect, just as the nasociliary nerve was. But it is behind the nasociliary nerve. The nasociliary nerve will be running anterior and parallel to it right there. As it moves along, it will give the following branches. It will give the lacrimal artery. Lacrimal artery, however, it will go and give the zygomatic branches also. Zygomaticofacial, zygomaticotemporal. As it moves along, it will give the two arteries that were on the top of the eyeball. Supraorbital, supratrochlear. As it moves to the lateral medial aspect, it will give the two branches to the ethmoidal foramina. Anterior ethmoidal artery, posterior ethmoidal artery. They will have a similar course. The anterior will go to the anterior cranial fossa and then down to the nose also. And as it moves along, as it exits the eye below the trochlea, it does not have the same name. Here the artery name is dorsal nasal artery. We did the lacrimal artery, we did the supraorbital trochlear, we did the anterior posterior ethmoidal and the dorsal nasal artery, and then we are left with the arteries that are going to supply the orbit, that are going to supply the eyeball. There are two set of arteries that are going to supply the eyeball. First, you can see this artery. It enters the optic nerve. It is a very important nerve that is called the central artery of the retina. It becomes the part of the optic nerve and that it goes and spreads around in the retina itself. It supplies the retina. And the very important thing to remember is central retinal artery. It is end artery. It does not have any connection to the other arteries that are going to the eyeball. So if that occludes, you are done. Retina stops functioning. It goes under ischemia and the blindness follows. So this is the end artery, the central retinal artery. And then there are two arteries, two set of arteries that go and enter the eyeball and they have the name ciliary in them. The one that are approaching the eyeball from the posterior aspect, that are known as the short ciliary arteries, the short posterior ciliary arteries, and the one that are going all the way across the eye and entering from the anterior aspect, that will be known as long ciliary artery or anterior ciliary arteries. So these are all the arteries that are going to supply the eyeball and the structures around it in the orbit. There will be very similar structure for the veins. There will be in the openings that there will be short ciliary, long ciliary, but here their name is not, they don't match exactly to that. The veins that are coming from the eyeball are not named as short ciliary and long ciliary. They are named as vorticose veins. There are 5 to 6 vorticose veins that are exiting from the orbit from the different points. These are vorticose veins. Similarly, there will be veins coming back from the muscles and the foramina that we discuss the arteries with, and they are draining into two set of veins, a set of two veins on the upper aspect of the eyeball and on the lower aspect of the eyeball, that are known as superior ophthalmic vein and inferior ophthalmic vein respectively. The superior ophthalmic vein and the inferior ophthalmic vein respectively. They're sometimes called superior orbital and inferior orbital veins also. Where do they go? Superior ophthalmic vein, the connections of the superior ophthalmic vein anteriorly, they do join with the facial vein, and posteriorly they do join with the cavernous sinus. That is how the connection of the danger area of the face is established to the cavernous sinus through the superior ophthalmic vein. The inferior ophthalmic vein, it is connected to the face through the infraorbital vein. It is connected directly to the connection infraorbital vein, directly with the connection of the facial vein, and it goes back and it may drain directly to the superior ophthalmic and consequently cavernous sinus, or it may go down to the pterygoid venous plexus. So these are all the veins that are present in the orbit and the drainage that is related to them. Let's take a 2 minute breather here and then we will continue from here from the structure of the eyeball. Okay, let's give it a last push. The eyeball. The eyeball It consists of three coats. It consists of the outer coat, that is the fibrous, that includes the sclera in the posterior 5/6 and the cornea in the anterior 1/6. There is a muscular coat. There is a pigmented vascular coat actually that includes the choroid behind and ciliary body, then iris, and then the pupil, the gap in front. And then there is a nervous coat that includes the retina behind, and it fronts in front, it just converts into the epithelium covering the back of the ciliary body and the epithelium covering the back of the iris. Let us look at the things one by one. Sclera. It is a fibrous coat. In some text it is written that it is the continuation of the dura mater covering from the optic nerve. It is the one that is giving strength to the eyeball. It is white in color that you can see, and it is thin in front and thick behind, but it is weakest at this point, the point where the optic nerve enters the eyeball. It passes by making a lot of small holes in the sclera that is known as lamina cribrosa. Sclera moves, if we look at front, it has superficially covered with tenons fascia and tenons capsule, and between them there is a very small slit of episcleral space that have a some amount of loose connective tissue and blood vessels, and they do get engorged when there is an inflammation. Otherwise they are not very visible and the eye is seen as white. On the sclera, there is the insertion of all the six extraocular muscles. They are inserted into the substance of the sclera, and here the fascia surrounding the muscle becomes continuous with the fascia surrounding the eyeball. Anterior aspect, the part of the sclera that is actually visible, the white that you see in your eyes, that is covered with the conjunctiva, a layer of epithelium, columnar epithelium that is covering the eye, that is conjunctiva, that is known as bulbar part of conjunctiva shown here, and this is a transparent epithelium membrane through which eyeball is seen, and between it and the eyeball there is the presence of some amount of loose connective tissue, and this is the one that does contain some capillaries, and this leads to the redness of eye if there is an inflammation, infection of anything else. Then there is cornea. We are not going to discuss the histology section. This is covered by stratified squamous epithelium. Then there is basement membrane of that. Then there is stroma. And in the inner aspect, there is simple squamous epithelium covering hair with basement membrane known as descendant membrane endothelium. This part, this cornea, it is transparent. Why it is transparent? Because the collagen fibers here have a very regular arrangement, very parallel arrangement, and there are no blood vessels inside the cornea. There are no blood vessels inside the cornea, and that is why the cornea, in order to survive, get its nutrients from the fluid that is present behind it in the aqueous humor. They simply diffuse through the cornea to reach it, and the oxygenation, it occurs through the surface. It simply occurs through the surface. That is why for the people wearing the contact lenses, it is very important that you get high quality contact lenses that allow the movement of air through themselves, that will lead to the oxygenation of the surface of cornea. And if not, the lenses, regardless of that, lenses should be regularly taken off and on so that you can aerate the surface of the cornea. Otherwise they will ulcerate because of the lack of oxygen, and that particular fact is very important in this view also, that it will lead to the better survival of the corneal transplants, because it does not have any blood, that will lead to the absence of the transported white blood cells and tissue rejection. And between the two junctions of the sclera and cornea, this junction is sclerocorneal junction. This junction, the ring outside the cornea between the sclera, this is known as limbus, sclerocorneal limbus. And here you can see the curvature changes, here the transparency changes, and the interesting thing inside is that there is a vein running inside the scleral venous sinus, the canal of Schlemm, that is running in the circle in the junction of the sclera and cornea. And in the inner aspect, I will be better shown in this zoomed area. And on the inner aspect, there is a spur of sclera, this word, a spur of sclera protruding towards the inside the chamber, that is known as scleral spur. And actually it is between the scleral spur and the sclerocorneal junction that this trabecular meshwork is present at the iridocorneal junction, through which the aqueous humor go and drain the drain into the canal of Schlemm. This canal of Schlemm is ultimately connected to the multiple veins that are present on the outside, the verticose veins, and that is how the aqueous humor is drained. Then talking about the vascular humor, the vascular chamber, sorry, the vascular layer, the vascular pigmented coat. The vascular coat is surrounding all of the eyeball. It is, as the name indicates, it is vascular. It contains a lot of blood vessels that are coming from the anterior and posterior ciliary arteries. It supplies the retina inside and the sclera outside. And in the inner aspect, this whole layer is very heavily pigmented on the outer aspect. Sorry, on the outer aspect, it is very heavily pigmented. On the inner aspect, it is vascular. And the role of the pigmented layer, it's to make an eyeball work as a black box. The nerves that are entering the eyeball, the light rays that are entering the eyeball, they don't go on jumping and reflecting and creating a halo of light inside. When they touch any part of the retina, they get absorbed, they send a signal, and they simply get absorbed in the pigmented layer. So it makes the eyeball work as a chamber, as a black box. If we move forward, we will see these things. These are ciliary body and the iris. The ciliary body, it consists of a different set of muscles. First, there is a set of muscles that are running in a circle all the way across the ciliary body around the eye. So these are circular fibers, and the fibers that are running from the calcaneal skull all the way back to the surface, these are the meridional fibers. Then there are some radial fibers also, not discussing them right now. The ciliary body has these muscles. On the medial aspect, ciliary body has these projections. These are known as ciliary processes. If you are able to appreciate in this video, the ciliary processes, these are lined by this yellow line. This yellow line is the epithelium, ciliary epithelium, that is covering the surface of the ciliary body. This epithelium is responsible for producing the aqueous humor, the fluid that will fill the anterior and posterior chamber. Second, the ciliary body, the ciliary processes, it's giving attachments to these fibers. These are known as suspensory ligaments of lens or the zonular fibers. They supply the lens, they get attached to the lens, and they help pulling the lens to flatten it or get relaxed to get it more contour. So here the function of the ciliary muscles come into play. When the ciliary muscles contract, the circular ones, the whole of the rings come near. And when the meridional contracts, the distance between these 2 points, it becomes less. It comes here. So what happens in each of them is these ciliary processes, they move to this point. ciliary process is moved more medially. When it moves more medially, the zonular fibers, the tension is released, and the zonular fibers, they are coming more medially, the tension is released, and the lens that was previously relatively flattened, it now gets more globular. It gives rise to high refractive power. So focus it helps you focus on near objects. So this is ciliary muscles function. So ciliary muscles, they have a parasympathetic supply that leads to their contraction, that leads to the loosening of the zonal fibers, that leads to making the lens more globular and ultimately helping you focus on the near objects. Second, the ciliary body was important in the production of the aqueous humor that will fill the anterior and posterior chambers of the eye, the aqueous chamber of the eye. So this is about the ciliary muscles. There is no very difference between the functioning of the two fibers, the meridional and the radial fibers and the circular fibers. They're ultimately all doing the same role. Then we come to this, the iris. It is filled with connective tissue anteriorly and it has epithelium posteriorly. You might be able to get a hint of a yellow line that is moving on the back of it. This yellow line, this epithelium that was covering the ciliary processes and that was covering the back aspect of the iris, this is the retina extension. That is the continuation of the nervous layer of the eyeball. It has no sensory function here. They're simply epithelium covering, giving the rise to the aqueous humor here, and they also have pigmented layer. And the pigment present in this epithelium layer is the major contributing factor for your eye color, the color of your iris. But yes, the pigmented layers, the pigments are also present in the connective tissue right here. In the connective tissue anteriorly, there is a pigment. If there is a pigment, the more the iris will move towards brown black color. And that is why high the dark skin colored people usually have brown black eyes. And if there is almost total absence of the eye color pigment, it will lead to the blue eyes. So that is why the more white people, the more Caucasians usually have a variety of eye color, because actually it is due to the absence of the pigment, the melanin pigment, that the rest of the connective tissue give rise to that refractive colors. Then we are coming to the muscles in the iris. The muscles in the iris are the ones that are making the circle, that are the sphincter pupillary muscles. They contract and they make pupils smaller. These are supplied by parasympathetic fibers. And then there are ones that are going like a wheel, spokes of the wheel from the center outwards. These are radially running. These are known as dilatory pupillary muscles. And you may have guessed it, they have sympathetic supply. They have sympathetic supply. So there is dilatory pupillary muscles and there is constrictor pupillary muscles. So this is all about the middle layer, the vascular pigmented coat of the eye. We talked about the choroid, its outer pigmented and inner vascular layer, the ciliary body, the ciliary process, suspensory ligaments, ciliary muscles, and their supply. And then we talked about the iris. The iris was dividing the eye in the aqueous chamber into the anterior part and the posterior part, and the muscles contained inside it, that was the that was sphincter muscles supplied by the peripheral parasympathetic and the dilator by sympathetic nervous system. The nervous cord, it is the retina. Most of it retina It is very thick. It consists of 10 layers. We will discuss it shortly. And it catches the light and sends the signals to the brain. If we move all the way front, here you can see the thickness dropping drastically. This point. At this point, beyond this point, it is visual. It is getting the signals. Here it is simply covering epithelium. The epithelium you saw on the undersurface of the ciliary body and the iris. So this line where this change occurs, this line is known as ora serrata. If we look at the chamber, it looks like a wavy line. So this is called ora serrata. You may see in the various models that are present in your uh, museums, in the back of the retina, you can see the back of the retina through the fundoscopy. Fundoscopy is looking through the opening of the eye to the back of the retina. Here in the back of the retina, you may see a few things. You will see the point where the nerve, optic nerve, enters along with the central artery of retina. This is known as optic disc. This is known as optic disc. It is where the optic nerve enter along with the central artery of the retina, and it does not have any rods and cones. It is a blind spot. You don't see anything here. And actually your eye is moving very rapidly, little like this saccadic movements, that it compensates for the blind spot, and it rapidly falls the image on the areas surrounding so that you don't get the blind area. However, if you do paralyze the muscles, extraocular muscles, and the eye cannot move, you do see the blind spot. It is just medial to the anteroposterior axis of the eye. It is medial to the anteroposterior axis of the eye. Okay. Then there is macula lutea and fovea centralis. Just to the lateral aspect of the anteroposterior axis, or just to the lateral of the optic disc, you can see this whole yellow area. The whole of it is yellow, but you can see this part is relatively more prominent. This yellow area is known as yellow disc, yellow spot, macula lutea, and in the center of it there is a dip. This dip is known as fovea centralis. Fovea centralis. Fovea centralis is the point of the most acute vision in your eye. It only consists of cones here, no rods are present here, and if you're looking at my pointer here, the image of the pointer is currently being made on your fovea centralis. It is the point with the highest concentration of the retina, highest concentration of the cones. Then we are left with the lens. The lens consists of layers of connective tissue fibers, mostly elastic. It has a capsule on its surrounding. On the anterior aspect, there is a simple layer of cuboidal epithelium, and this is the layer that, as it duplicates, it goes to the periphery, and the cells elongate and flatten, and they become the part of these zonular fibers, and this the part of the fibers that are flattened fibers that enclose whole of the lens. And the central part is the nucleus, and the periphery is those fibers, and they continue to get deposited throughout the life, and that's why you get problems with the focus in the older age. Let me So the lens has a capsule, the the capsular epithelium in front that is usually cuboidal, and the different fibers, the elongated fibers that are making the major part of the lens. That is not much to discuss here. There is the layers of cornea, the stratified squamous epithelium in front, followed by basement membrane, that is Bowman's layer. Then there is trauma, used with very regularly arranged stromal fibers. Then there is simple squamous epithelium, endothelium on the inner aspect with its basement membrane known as Tessemaint's membrane. And this structure of the cornea, it's very sensitive to the touch. And if you asked about the blinking reflex, the blinking reflex occurs when the cotton wisp touches the surface, and the sensory fibers are carried through the nasociliary nerve to the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, and within the pons they get synapsed with the facial nerve nucleus, and the efferent fibers come and they contract the orbicularis oculi muscles, and they contract the eye eyelids, I mean. So these are the things about the contents of the eyeball. We have discussed about the light. You must have may have read discuss the light pathway in the physiology lectures, the special senses that are coming up the crash course. You can follow this video playlist and you can go through that. This light pathways goes through the cornea, aqueous chamber, lens, vitreous chamber, and then falls on the retina. The whole detail is discussed in the physiology lecture. The thing I want to discuss is that there is the maximum bending of light occurs at the interface of air and cornea, because there is a highest difference of refractive chamber. And then there is a confusion that most refraction occurs at the cornea. Then why the lens is so important? Because for whole of these structures, the lens is the one thing that actually can change its diopter, that can change its focal length, and it helps to focus it on the retina. We talked about the chambers. The chamber that is present anterior to the lens, that is the aqueous chamber. It is further divided into posterior and anterior chambers. That aqueous, it is filled with aqueous humor, the fluid. The aqueous humor was being produced by around the ciliary processes and drained into the posterior chamber, then moves through the pupil into the anterior chamber, and in the anterior chamber it moves to the angle between cornea and iris, the iridocorneal junction, and from here it moves through the trabeculae to go into the veins that are canal of Schlemm. And here any blockage in this pathway may lead to glaucoma, that is the high pressure of the aqueous chamber. The closed angle glaucoma is the one where sometimes this iris, it gets attached here before going back, so it is blocking the pathway of the aqueous humor draining. So this is known as closed angle, the narrow angle glaucoma, and that is solved by making a pathway, that is solved by making an opening that leads to the drainage of the glaucoma. And then there is open angle glaucoma, that it may be blockage in the trabecular network, or there may be blockage in the canal of Schlemm, or surplus production in the ciliary bodies. So it is usually controlled medically, and there are some surgical procedures there too, but we will stop right here, not going into the detail in anatomy. And then there is this chamber, the behind the lens in front of the retina, that is known as the haloid vitreous chamber, and it is a jelly-like substance that gives support to the whole of the eyeball, and it keeps the retina pushed back to the choroid. The retina and choroid are not very much, well, technically not retina and choroid. The retina itself has two layers. The retina itself has sensory layer and the pigmented layer. You can see this layer is the pigmented layer. This whole is the neural layer. So the neural layer and the retinal and the pigmented layer are not physically attached to one another. They are pushed back by this vitreous chamber. And if there is some trauma, these two layers may get separated from one another, and that is called the detachment of retina, and that leads to the blindness until the retina it's pushed back to its normal place. Talking about the layers of the retina, talking about the layers of the retina, if we look from the deep to the surface, the layers are usually numbered. Then there is a, if we look from the deep to the surface, it is covered with, there is pigmented layer of epithelium. Then there is layer of rods and cones, the sensory receptor component of the cells. There is outer limiting membrane. Then there is the nuclear layer of the rods and cones, that is outer nuclear layer. Then there is a plexus of the nerves where the rods and cones synapse with the next set of nerves, that is the outer plexiform layer. Then there is layer of bipolar cells. Then there is next layer of synapse between the bipolar axons and the next neurons, that is inner plexiform layer. And the next neurons are ganglion cell layer. And then there is nerve fiber layer, that is the axons of these ganglion cells, and this is actually the optic nerve that will exit. And just near the vitreous body, it all is limited by the inner limiting membrane. So these are the 10 layers of retina. We will discuss it in the histology lectures, inshallah. And in addition to it, there are other cells like amacrine cells, the horizontal cells, and the supporting cells that are running vertically, that are the Muller cells. The light that comes, actually it comes from this way all the way through this layer, and they activate the receptors right here. And the signal that is then generated, it moves back through the rods and cones, through the bipolar, through the ganglion, or all the way to the optic pathway. I will not be discussing the optic pathway in this lecture. You have discussed that in the physiology lecture. I will have a quick summary, a quick revision when we will be talking about the cranial nerves, inshallah. So this is all about the layers of the retina. And then let's talk a little about the rods and cones. This is the pathway. Rods and cones, then bipolar, then ganglion, then optic nerve. Roads, this is the picture from the Kaplan's neuroanatomy. The roads are the ones that detect the low light, that are active in the low light situations. They do not have any color, they simply go black and white, achromatic, light sensitive, and they are very sensitive to motion. They're very sensitive to motion. And the animals that hunt at night have very high quantity of rods, like feline animals like cat and lion and tiger. And the cones are of different colors. There are red, blue, green, the primary colors, and they are chromatic thus, and they are sensitive to bright light, and they make and join to form different colors, and they are responsible for object recognition. Visual pathway I'm going to skip right now. You have discussed in the physiology lecture. You made and you will discuss it again with me in the cranial nerve section. So I am skipping the visual pathways and the reflexes. So just going to the last topic, that is periorbital structure, that is majorly the eyelid and lacrimal apparatus. The eyelid is the musculocutaneous, fibromusculocutaneous structure that is covering the anterior aspect of the eyeball, giving its protection. In the center, it consists of a fibrous tissue, a fibrous plate that is known as the tarsal plate. Here it is written as tarsus. On the anterior aspect of the tarsal plate, there is presence of the orbicularis oculi muscle, and there is presence of the tendon of the levator palpebrae superioris. This muscle, you can see it is coming and inserting on the anterior aspect of the tarsal plate. So tarsal plate is basically thickened lower portion of the orbital septum shown here that is attached to the orbital margins, and it comes all the way down to the tip of the eyelids. So this is about the tarsal plates, the muscles insertion, the orbicularis oculi and levator are anterior to it. A little muscle, some people consider it a part of the levator palpebrae superioris that attach to the top of the tarsal plate. It arises from the levator palpebrae superioris and attached to the top of the tarsal plate. This is called the superior tarsal or Muller's muscle. So it has a role in the opening of the eyelid and a part that is majorly supplied by the sympathetic supply. So this is the eyelid, the orbital plate, the tarsal plate. Medially and laterally, there is a presence of a ligament that is the medial and lateral palpebral ligament. We saw them in detail. They are not very clearly shown in these pictures, but they are present and we saw them in detail when we talked about the when talked about the muscles of the facial expressions. I can show you in the 3D model here. So this is basically the medial palpebral ligament. The medial palpebral ligament gives insertion and origin to the orbicularis oculi, the palpebral part, and it is giving insertion to the part of the levator palpebrae superioris also. So they are making the medial and lateral aspect of the eye, and these are the palpebral ligaments. Then there are different glands that are present inside. There are a set of glands that is present inside the tarsal plate. These glands are known as meibomian glands. These are sebaceous in nature. These are sebaceous in nature, and they open up on the tip of the eyelid just behind the eyelashes. Just behind the eyelashes. Then there is set of two set of glands, that is gland of Zeiss and gland of Moll. Gland of Zeiss is sebaceous glands, and like the sebaceous gland in rest of the body, they do open into the hair follicle. It is I don't have very nice pictures for that right now. The gland of Zeiss that opens onto the hair follicle and through the eyelashes opening, it comes to the surface. And the glands of Moll, they are apocrine sweat glands, serous in nature, and they open between the hair follicles that are the eyelashes on the tip of the eyelid. And last but not the least, we are left with lacrimal apparatus, the apparatus that produces the tears. The lacrimal gland is present on the superolateral aspect of the orbit, just below the floor of the just below the roof of the orbit at the junction of the roof and the lateral wall. That is the lacrimal fossa right here in which the gland is present. The gland is divided into two parts due to the passing through levator palpebrae superioris muscle. The part that is superior to it or deep, that is known as orbital part, and the part that is present below it near the eye superficial to it, that is the lacrimal part, palpebral part, because it is present near the eyelids, palpebral part. These are opening through multiple small opening into the fornix, into the conjunctival fornix, and in the conjunctiva they are secreted here and they get into the conjunctival fornix here. Conjunctiva, we can talk about it here. Conjunctiva, it is shown by a white line in this picture. Conjunctiva covers the inner aspect of the eyelid, palpebral conjunctiva. It covers the outer aspect of the cornea, bulbar conjunctiva, and it turns around the angle, and that is known as conjunctival fornix, the superior one up, inferior one below. So if the eyelids close, these two margins meet and the conjunctiva form actually a type of sac, a type of space in front of the eye. So these are the conjunctiva, and it is opening into the superior conjunctival fornix. If you see blinking, Google blinking in a slow motion camera. The lateral part of the eyelid close first and they go on to meet towards the medial aspect. So this eyelid help this lateral to medial closing that is not visible in our normal eyes. You can see only with the high speed camera. It push the lacrimal, the tears towards the medial aspect of the eye. They come here, and when they come here they reach on this aspect. This pinkish area below the medial angle of the eye, this is known as lake for the tears, the tear lake, the lacrimal lake, the lacus lacrimalis, this whole area. Here there is a mountain inside, there is a raised area that is known as lacrimal caruncle, and just in the valley of this uh, caruncle there are two openings on the two medial most part. These are lacrimal papilla, the raised areas of the skin, and on the top of it, the openings are known as a lacrimal punctum. The tears, the lacrimal secretion that come, they move medially, they gather here, and they are drained through these openings. They are drained through these to the lacrimal canaliculi, and from here it goes to the lacrimal sac, and from the lacrimal sac they go through the lacrimal duct, nasolacrimal duct, and open into the inferior nasal meatus and nasal cavity. So this is the pathway for the tears, that is pathway for the lacrimal system, and any disruption in it can lead to it flowing outwards. For example, emotional or irritational, there is increased production of the tears. The production surpasses the drainage capacity and it will lead to the tears going outside. Even when you see a person who is going to cry, there is accumulation here in the lake and inferior the low along the lower margin can be seen the tears about to fall out. And the other thing is there may be a blockade in the canaliculi, in the puncta, that may lead to the secretion going outside. So this is all about the lacrimal apparatus, and the lacrimal apparatus we discussed a little its sensory supply. That parasympathetic supply to the lacrimal gland is coming originally from the facial nerve. It has moved through geniculate ganglion, greater petrosal nerve, nerve of pterygoid canal to the pterygopalatine ganglion. Here the preganglionic fiber synapse and the postganglionic fiber go through the connection to the maxillary nerve, then zygomatic nerve, then zygomaticotemporal, and through then communicating branch to the lacrimal nerve that brings it to the lacrimal gland. The similar pathway is from the sympathetic. Sympathetic fiber reaches the pterygopalatine ganglion through the deep petrosal nerves when it joins the nerve of pterygoid canal. It reaches the pterygopalatine ganglion, and from here to the lacrimal gland, the pathway is the same. So that's it. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope it helped you with developing the concepts of orbit and the structures, orbit, the eye, and the related structures. If you have any questions, suggestions, feedbacks, please mention in the comments below. And inshallah, see you in the next lecture. Till then, good luck and Allah Hafiz.